Welcome to Dialogue Doodles, everyone. I'm Jack, and today we're diving into the fascinating world of one of history's most influential minds, David Hume. With me is Professor Aidan Morrison, an expert on Enlightenment philosophy. Aidan, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Jack. I'm excited to share Hume's incredible story and ideas with your listeners.
You know, Aidan, what amazes me most about Hume is how his ideas, formed in the 18th century, still feel incredibly relevant today. But before we dive into his philosophy, here's something that might surprise our listeners. Hume entered university at the age of 12. 12? What was that about?
It's remarkable, isn't it? This was in Edinburgh, 1723. But what's even more fascinating is that this wasn't just about Hume being a child prodigy. It actually tells us a lot about both the Scottish education system of the time and Hume's unique intellectual journey.
I imagine that must have shaped his thinking in some profound ways. How did such an early start influence his development?
Well, interestingly, it led to both brilliant insights and personal struggles. By 18, Hume actually experienced what we'd now call a nervous breakdown from the intensity of his philosophical studies. But this crisis became a turning point that shaped his entire philosophical approach.
That's fascinating. The idea that personal crisis could shape philosophical thinking. Could you tell us more about how that experience influenced him?
Of course. After his breakdown, Hume began to question everything, not just what we know, but how we know it. He realized that intense rational thinking alone wasn't the answer. This led him to France, where he wrote his masterwork, A Treatise of Human Nature, in his 20s.
You know what strikes me about this? It's almost like his personal journey mirrors his later philosophical insights. This idea that pure reason isn't everything, that experience plays a crucial role.
Exactly, Jack. His personal experience led him to one of his most revolutionary ideas, that all human knowledge comes from experience rather than pure reason or innate ideas. This was radical for his time.
Could you break that down for our listeners? What exactly does it mean that all knowledge comes from experience?
Think of it this way: Hume argued that our mind is like a blank canvas at birth. Everything we know, every idea we have, comes from what we've experienced through our senses. He called these experiences impressions.
So impressions are like the raw data of experience?
Exactly. And then we form ideas, which are like copies of these impressions, but usually fainter. For instance, feeling actual pain is an impression, while remembering pain later is an idea. This became known as Hume's copy principle.
That's fascinating. Could you give us a concrete example of how this works in everyday life?
Consider someone who's never seen the color red. No matter how eloquently you describe it, they can't truly understand what red is. They need the actual experience, the impression, to form the idea of redness.
That reminds me, isn't this particularly relevant today with artificial intelligence? AI systems also learn from experience, rather than being pre-programmed with all knowledge.
Yes, it's remarkable how Hume's insights align with modern machine learning. Both rely on patterns of experience rather than innate knowledge. Though Hume would probably be fascinated by how AI challenges some of his assumptions about consciousness and learning.
Speaking of patterns, I understand Hume had some pretty revolutionary ideas about cause and effect. How does that connect to his views on experience?
This is where things get really interesting. Hume argued that even our understanding of cause and effect is just based on observed patterns, not on logical necessity. When we see one billiard ball hit another, we don't actually see the causation, we just see one event followed by another repeatedly.
Wait, are you saying we can't be certain that causes actually produce their effects?
That's exactly what Hume argued. We assume causation because we've seen patterns repeat, but we can't actually observe the necessary connection. It's just habit of mind, what he called custom.
That seems almost unsettling. The idea that even something as basic as cause and effect might just be a mental habit rather than an absolute truth.
It is unsettling, and that's exactly what made Hume's ideas so revolutionary. But here's what's fascinating: the skepticism about causation led him to an even more profound insight about how we make moral judgments.
Oh, this is where we get into his famous is-ought problem, right?
Exactly. Just as we can't see necessary connections in cause and effect, Hume pointed out that we can't derive moral conclusions, what ought to be, purely from factual observations about what is.
Could you break that down with an example for our listeners?
Think about it this way: you could have all the scientific data in the world about climate change, rising temperatures, melting ice caps, changing weather patterns, but none of that data, by itself, tells you what we ought to do about it. The jump from facts to moral prescriptions requires something more.
That's really interesting. So you're saying there's always a gap between describing how things are and concluding how things should be?
Precisely. And this insight is incredibly relevant today, especially in our data-driven world. We often think that if we just gather enough data, the right course of action will become obvious. But Hume showed us why that's not the case.
I can see huge implications for artificial intelligence here. We're trying to program AI systems to make ethical decisions, but if Hume is right, we can't just feed them data and expect moral judgments to emerge.
That's a brilliant connection. Take self-driving cars, for instance. We can program them with all sorts of data about traffic patterns, physics, and human behavior, but at some point, we have to make value judgments about whose safety to prioritize in unavoidable accident scenarios.
So what did Hume think was the basis for moral judgments, if not pure reason or empirical observation?
Hume argued that moral judgments ultimately stem from our sentiments, our emotions and feelings. He believed that reason alone is insufficient for moral decision-making. We need emotional capacities like empathy and moral sentiment.
That seems almost counterintuitive in today's world, where we often try to remove emotion from decision-making in favor of pure data and logic.
And that's exactly why Hume's insights are more relevant than ever. He'd probably argue that our modern obsession with pure data-driven decision-making is missing something fundamental about human nature in moral reasoning.
This makes me think about how we approach complex policy decisions today. We can't just look at statistics and economic data to determine what's right, can we?
You've hit on a crucial point there, Jack. Take healthcare policy, for example. We can have all the data about costs, treatment outcomes, and population health, but ultimately, decisions about resource allocation involve value judgments that can't be derived purely from that data.
That's fascinating. So how do we navigate this gap between facts and values in practical decision-making?
Well, Hume would say we need to be honest about the role of both reason and sentiment. We should use data and empirical evidence, absolutely, but also acknowledge that our moral intuitions and emotional responses play a legitimate role in ethical reasoning.
I imagine this has huge implications for how we think about scientific research and ethics committees today.
Absolutely. Consider genetic engineering or AI development. Scientists can tell us what's possible, but determining what we should do with these capabilities requires ethical frameworks that go beyond pure empirical observation.
You know what strikes me? How Hume's personal journey, which we discussed earlier, seems to mirror this integration of reason and sentiment. He moved from pure rational study to a more balanced approach after his crisis.
That's a brilliant observation. His life experience taught him that pure reason alone wasn't enough, whether in understanding the world or making moral judgments. It's why he valued both rigorous thinking and human emotion.
As we wrap up our discussion, I'm curious, what do you think would be Hume's advice to someone trying to navigate our data-rich, morally complex modern world?
I think he'd encourage us to embrace both empirical evidence and our moral sentiments. Don't ignore the data, but also don't expect it to solve moral dilemmas for you. And most importantly, be humble about what we can know with certainty.
And what about his legacy? How do you see Hume's ideas continuing to influence future discussions, especially as we develop more advanced AI and face new ethical challenges?
Hume's insights about the limits of pure reason and the importance of experience become more relevant every day. As we develop AI systems and face new moral challenges, his warning about the is-ought gap remains crucial. We can't automate moral reasoning simply by processing more data.
It's remarkable how a philosopher from the 18th century could provide such relevant insights for our 21st century challenges.
That's the mark of truly great philosophy, isn't it? Hume's ideas about experience, causation, and moral reasoning aren't just historical curiosities, they're tools for understanding our world today.
Well, this has been a fascinating journey through Hume's ideas and their modern relevance. Aidan, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today.
Thank you, Jack. It's been a pleasure exploring these ideas with you.
And to our listeners, thanks for joining us on this exploration of one of history's most influential minds. Until next time, keep thinking deep.